This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, June the 10th, 2018, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, rainy weather. We've had quite a bit of that in the last 48 hours or so, and everything else related to conservation and whatever is on Dave's mind.
Yeah, well, thank you to Bill Saylor for holding fort last week. He exemplified the sort of thing we do after a radio program. He followed the script and went around, took photographs, and included them using a Vegas program to make this program a visual program or television program. It takes a surprising amount of work. David's been doing it for a long time. And it just takes us a while to put pictures in it, but they really give the program a quality. And it can be a photograph or a chart or a diagram or a map. And we're all used to getting that information together. So thank you, Bill, for doing that. In passing, Dot Rippling passed. She was a fabric artist of quite some note, and so she'll be missed in Spinners and Weavers and other organizations that she worked with, and at a national, possibly even an international level. Larry Ziemer, another artist from Monticello, passed, and he had been born there, traveled some, and came back there, and was a local artist of note. I have a rather important announcement. It's regarding coal ash in the Salt Fork of the Vermilion River. It's power related. It's where you have ash that's left after coal has burned. And it's not necessarily fly ash. Fly ash is what is acquired in the smokestacks with procedures like ion exchange that allows you to pick up some of the materials that are in the flue. The concern in Vermilion County is coal ash, just like you would burn a log in a fire and you're left with ashes. It's on the banks of the Vermilion River, and it's the state's only natural river, and heavy metals and other materials are already being found in the river and in the aquifers. The mining has allowed deep access to the aquifer, and the meeting will be to try and elucidate what might be possible. And they have a range of speakers of quite some note, and it would behoove us to be there, if you can possibly be there. 5 to 8 on Monday, that's tomorrow. And if you want to speak, that's even better. If you want to leave a note of concern. But this is a situation where they would like to have the material lifted to a higher level, away from the river, and contained with plastic liners so that there wouldn't be any leakage. The other alternative to doing that is to send it to another state where the material is registered in and surveyed in, so that you know where it is and what it is. It's very expensive, and so there's a general reluctance to want to do something with those sorts of situations, but it's rather serious, and serious people are involved. So if you can possibly get to Vermilion County, it's at the community college, and if you don't know where that is, just ask. But 5 to 8 on Monday, and a rather serious meeting for this area. It's a little bit like what you had in Clinton with landfill. It's just important enough for you to be there. I have another thank you to give. We've moved most all of the Pocket Prairie now, but I really want to give a shout out to those people who have been generous enough to help us move, help us drive hi-hos and other equipment, and contribute to the cost of moving that prairie to 2nd Street. Just a wonderful array of people who've come and helped at fairly short notice. I'm thinking to be in the parade. I think we need to have our image out there. There are people who recognize what we do, and we have to be a totem pole for what we do. So I will probably be walking the parade, and I may be looking for a driver to drive the vehicle. We'll probably have a sign on either side to say that the Pocket Prairie has moved to 2nd Street, where the detention basin is. It's just a quarter mile away, and it's growing. We have some problems with it because it's in some of it's in a lower spot than we expected. So the recent rains have created a flood. And although Prairie grew up with lots of water, they didn't grow up with roots that were covered perpetually with water. So people have tried to siphon out the water, but we've had several rains that replaced the water. So I bought a hand pump, a bilge pump. It's a sort of pump that you can pump water out of a well when you don't have any power, or water out of a boat, or water out of a basin like we have. It may mean that in the long run we have to move the prairie to a new site. But there's 3 sites, and you can see them by going to the road complex behind the Habitat off of University Avenue, or you can come in from 1st Street behind Taylor Glass. That just being aware is helpful, and we still need help. The plants need to be treated with tender, loving care. It will take probably 5 years for those plants to blossom out in a new location free of weeds. We've disturbed the soil, so you're going to get quite a few weeds. We are hoping that the wildlife there will stay to the south pond. The wildlife includes Canada geese and ducks and herons, and it's just, in a way, it's quite exciting. I was there last night, and a couple with children were rather excited because they had watched a snapping turtle come up on the bank and find a spot in the lawn and dig a hole and lay 10 eggs. And that sort of thing is sort of what we look for when we try to interpret the landscape and the prairie that we have there. Will be in the domain of the city, and that too helps us because it puts the spirit of trying to have people aware of prairie in the public domain. So much appreciation to all those people who have helped. It's kind of interesting that the boneyard runs by without being a pond. It's got little waterfalls, and you have to imagine the netters sitting there and catching bacteria and little pieces of organic matter that come down through the river. But as it rains, the river rises and it fills that big basin where the geese and ducks seem to find a home and generate young families. But we use that river to provide water when the site is not wet, and people are genuinely interested in what we're doing. So join the crowd, visit occasionally, bicycle the walkways, and just enjoy the site. We have to be very careful not to violate the dignity of the lawns. This is natural history, and it has a rambunctiousness that is not common in lawns. And you have to know that people have gotten used to mowing lawns. They like to ride their bicycles across it. They like to walk it. They like to picnic on it. So we have to be careful to make sure that our prairie is confined to its domain, and that it will be labeled. Labels may cost us a little money. It's a little bit like the parade. If you're going to have a picture of the pocket prairie as it's in its new location, or a map, that probably costs $200 to do that sort of thing. So we just have to figure out how we can do it and just enjoy it. Sit on the banks of the boneyard and see the little fingerlings that are in there. I thought it's almost time for some of you to get to know your prairie plants. We'll try and put some pictures in because it means so much. We have to speak long enough on the radio to let you see a picture on television. So we'll take a general shot of what remains of the little prairie, the pocket prairie. It faces Chestnut Street, and it's probably about 15 by 20 feet, but it's loaded with prairie species, and we hope that it will remain. It seems like it will. So that will give you an idea of a balance between indigo and dark and rosinweed and little blue stem and the various prairie plants. So we'll give you a general shot, and
I'm sure the picture online will show this, but can you just tell the people who maybe won't ever see the video, if they go over there to the detention ponds, where can they go to actually see the transplanted plants? It's on the north part, not the southern, the old original one?
You go to behind the Habitat for Humanity off of University Avenue, and it was where 2nd Street used to be, so it's known as the 2nd Street Dig, and it's basically a detention pond that allows water to accumulate and then be let out slowly so that you don't have to boat on Green Street.
as some of us remember. So is it all on one side or the other? Or is it on the east side or the west side of
It's
the
on
pond?
the west side of the boat.
So it's all on the west side. Okay.
You could see it from the east side, so you don't even have to get out of your car. But it would be nice if you walked down and saw it. It's not a very interesting prairie at the moment because it's all plants that have been dug up and treated harshly, but they're growing. And some of them have been used to being under a canopy, and they're shade-loving plants. So some of them we have put sal on. And sal is a sort of grid of plastic that gives the plants shade that they have been used to. Normally we would have a tree or a small forest that would demonstrate that. In this case, we're all out in the open, so the shade-loving plants are having to get used to a lot of sun.
Another question, pardon my barging in here. It sounds like, I have to admit, I didn't actually help to do this stuff. So is it mostly down near the water level?
Yes.
Along the edge of the pond?
Near to water level. So when there's a 5-inch rain, it would be covered for probably about 2 days.
That's a significant change from the Pocket Prairie, too, because that was a relatively dry area over there.
Yes,
so but you're saying
dry.
They're going to survive. They were actually, historically, they would have survived in swampish area anyway. So as long as they're not drowning in water, you figure that they'll make it.
Yes, we have had to cut their roots some, and so they're not normal in any way. So they're trying to reestablish. And some of these plants will last in water for a while, but what you're hoping to do is that those little thread-like roots will start to grow, and it takes some time to do that. So we'll be out there with a pump to try and liberate those roots. Well, I thought that perhaps I would encourage you to look at some of the plant families. One of them that's kind of easy to recognize is the Silphium family, and prime amongst that is a compass plant. We don't have that in the little Chestnut Street piece that's left, but we dug it up, and it was quite a huge root, and it had to be cut off, of course, but we hope that it will grow in the new location. Compass plants have leaves that are invaginated. That means they're cut up so that they lose a lot of their stomates and they don't lose a lot of water. So they're drought resistant. And those leaves face north and south, and that was very helpful to settlers who couldn't find their way in a prairie. So there's also a dock, which has a whole leaf, but interestingly, if you put your hands on either side, you can find it's cool, and that's its mechanism for surviving in a dry situation. Not that it's in a dry situation at the moment, but you can see these plants in their reality on Chestnut Street. Rosinweed is a member of the family. It doesn't have the deep root of compass plant and dock, but it has rosin, and so if you injure it at all, it has a rosinous sap that is helpful in its drought resistance. And then there's a cup plant. And cup plant doesn't have the deep root of the other, its two sisters, but it is it's a little on the weedy side, but it's already decided to grow, and you will use it as a demo for the moment, but it's a very aggressive plant, and we would like to control it if it gets too wild. So that's the Silphium family. There are grasses, and the grass family probably likes it a little drier. There's some plants like cordgrass that like it damp. There's a spectrum. So you have cordgrass in a damp area, and you have at the other end of the spectrum, the little blue stem on a high spot. So in between you have big blue stem, Indian grass, and big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Switchgrass is popular because it stays up over winter and can be a home for eggs for pheasants and the like. So it has been bred to be a plant that is well used in a number of different habitats. It can actually last for 8 days underwater. That's if you pick the right variety. So that the Gromini family is the grasses. So then there are the legumes, and two that you might see in our retinue of pictures is Baptisia, which has white flowers. They're flowering at the present time, and it belongs to the pea family, legumes, and it's very nutritious. If you want to get the seed that come in a heavy pod, you have to beat the insects that know that this is a nutritious plant. So they eat the seeds and as well as the leaves and the like. Lead plant we have dealt with. Last week we had a tall, 8-foot-high lead plant that has been transferred to the 2nd Street dig, and it probably had roots in a radius of 20 feet. We had to dig down and cut those roots off, and it will take a while to reestablish itself. We're watching all these plants, and many of them are starting to grow. Another easy plant for you to check out is the mint family, and bee balm is a mint that is very attractive to bumblebees, and that is something you can pick up. The mint family is usually rather aromatic and has square stems. So if you get to know these 10 or 15 species, you're well on the way to knowing about prairie. Another one that's easy to follow is Rosaceae, the rose family. And so we have a little wild rose that is a single rose, but in the last few weeks it has been expressing itself very well. And so,
I think that was Dave's cell phone.
So somebody is probably calling in. But it's so the rose family has things like coreopsis, and there's a bunch of helianthus or sunflowers, and you can get to know those: yellow coneflower, purple coneflower. These are plants that belong to the sunflower family. And I've already mentioned the forest understory plants like bloodroot and ginger and Solomon seal, and there are more that could be, but this will be an open area prairie. Around the detention pond, there are some areas that have already been prepared for pollinators, and So I was talking to May Berenbaum, who is chair of the entomology department and very much an expert on bees, and I was saying we have a difficulty with prairies and pollinators being in the same territory, because the pollinating people are quite prone to using cultivated plants like sweet clover, which are our worst weed, and we have to remove it at a considerable cost. So we try to explain to people that pollinator plots and prairie plots are kind of different, and we would like to know about that. We like to encourage the native bees, and that includes the bumblebees that go back to those mints. During the week, we've had just a lot of administrative things to do. If you're trying to keep something like Heartland Pathways together, you really need to be a CEO or someone who checks that out. And that means you have to have a background board and a number of people who are interested. One of the interesting things that happened during the week was that we had a call from people from the Natural History Survey to do snake research on a Pope Prairie that we have in Rantoul. They are looking for a snake which they haven't seen for quite some time, but they're rather pleased to find the Pope Prairie and to find crayfish holes. Crawdads create a hole, and often the snakes will find their way into those holes. Surprisingly enough, sometimes there are different snakes together overwintering in such a hole. They usually put down a board, probably 3x3 plywood board, and encourage the snakes to come out, and they then lift up that board carefully and see if they have some of this rather rare snake. There are areas around that are also damp. We have a nice little creek that runs down off the Bloomington Moraine through the natural area, and that's where the crawdads like to be. We are interested in the Natural History Survey's work because in the long run we would like to see that the Pope Prairie is a headquarters for an extended pathway, bikeway, to Paxton. It's 10 miles, and it has quite a lot of prairie species on it. There's a wetland at the Rantoul end that simulates the outwash plain of Flatville. There's a cemetery which provides history. There's a mesic habitat as you go up the face of the Bloomington Moraine, and then there's dry areas with loess on the top, and you gently go down to Ludlow and then extend to the outwash plain creeks that drain the Paxton Moraine, and there's a prospect cemetery there that is rather nice, and all along this corridor there are prairie plants, and with a little bit of pizzazz, this could be restored. We've been talking to the Department of Transportation because it's their domain, and they have encouraged studies on roadside wildlife. They're planting roadside prairies, and those studies have included the Pope Prairie. They're very aware that certain plants would be more adaptable and more acceptable on a roadside. So there is now a committee within the Department of Transportation at Springfield that's chaired by Stephanie Dobbs, who was the regional director for landscape work with the Department of Transportation, with headquarters in Paris. That's the region that covers us. And she is now in charge of roadside maintenance of prairie and the planting of prairie. So we have some hopes. The difficulty is that when Department of Transportation puts in a road, a bicycle way, it is usually yay wide, and it usually takes out a lot of the prairie that you're hoping to save. In the case of this particular corridor, it was intended to have a dual highway, and the creation of 57 going a round tool obviated that creation, but the land remains a little wider because the purchases were made with the widening intent and the dual highway intent. The ash trees were planted on the second, what would have been the second highway, and they've been dying due to emerald ash borer. But it's interesting and intriguing that the prairie that was in that area that was relatively undisturbed has been starting to grow, and just because it gets more light now that the ash trees are saved. We don't go over there very much because the disease is carried by your feet, and we are losing ash trees everywhere, and part of it is that we move wood around and we move ourselves around, and that moves the disease. But just as one request to study the Pope Prairie is very helpful because it gives some dignity to the prairie, and perhaps we'll have some other research there too. At Lake Park, we have talked to Anne there, and we have some weed problems. If you have a small prairie and you have it mown toward the edge, there are some plants that like to be mown. The chicory and ragweed and a few others start to grow on the edge. And if you're not very careful, the pathway that you created that was 4 feet wide then becomes 5 feet wide because you get a mower that's just wide enough to take out the weeds. But then you have another bunch of weeds. And if you do this too much, eventually you don't have any prairie left because the weeds take over.
You want to handle that?
So we're looking for stewards there who will take down the ragweed especially. There's some reed canary grass problem, which is a mongrel weed. But doing that involves the Master Naturalist program and a formal agreement with the Lake Park homeowners, and it's not quite as easy as you might think to used that 2.5 acres as a demonstration site. But what I'm trying to say is that in order to do this sort of thing, you have to have some sort of administrative role where you can talk to people, and there's a headquarters. And WEF does that reasonably well, despite some difficulties. But it's always not easy to do these sorts of things. I got a zoning board of appeals registered letter from Monticello on somebody that has property that backs up onto our Heartland Pathways, needs to increase the size of his garage. It's nowhere near our site, but the fact that his property backs onto the railroad bed where the city of Monticello has established a quite interesting and successful rail trail, we're just legally notified, and I don't think that's any problem. I have a docket from the Sousa Foundation, which cares for music, and we had a bunch of music archives that we went to where we could go with them. We went to the Banner Free Library and other music centers, and it was suggested that the Sousa people might be interested, and certainly they were. So that's another administrative detail where we have to give permission to save what is interesting and to perhaps get rid of information that is not archivable. If you archived everything, you would have warehouses everywhere with material that couldn't be utilized. So archivists are very good at picking out details that will go on for another generation and more. Just talking to people and getting them to realize that their heritage ecosystem is in danger, and that they should know something about its plants and how they interact. There are 110 broadleaves plus about 6 or 7 grasses, and it behooves us to know that this is genetic material that we don't know what we might want to use it for in the future. It might be for a new plant, a new soybean, for instance, that would be mown for 20 years. Or it may be that we need the biochemistry, some small organic material might be an answer to a disease that we don't even know we might get yet. So that this stuff needs to be around. And so there are quite a few restoration prairies like Meadowbrook Park, but what we are most concerned about is remnant spots that give us an idea of what the prairie was like when settlement occurred. And you have to know that those plots of land are very dynamic, and if you have microorganisms and bacteria and fungi and small creatures, they can adapt to new situations and change. So when you exercise your imagination to figure out what was, you are making a guess, and that guess is what we like to find remnant sites so that we can justify our guess as to what a prairie was like and how it might adapt. The Prairie is a very good example of that, where an old road went through the parallel to the railroad line, but the more modern Route 45 going north, went out around a cemetery, and that created a site for visual corridor for headlights to shine on. So billboards were there until it was decided to put in 57 and the traffic went in that direction. So that billboard site became somewhat obsolete. That's when we bought that plot of land. But the plot of land is on the Bloomington Moraine, and it's largely gravel. It's called till. It's glacial till. It's come down with the glaciation, continental glaciation, and 8 feet of gravel was removed. So the prairie has, around the edges of the borrow pit or gravel pit were plants that are native, and on the other side, to the west side of that triangle, there is an old road, and then there's an old interurban, and both those sites have rights of way that support native plants, and it's just amazing to watch it hundreds of times and find that is possibly what was natural in the past, and we take that seed and move it across to the regrow succession site, which is doing a good job of coming back by itself. You have to be careful that you don't have an overabundance of one plant, or that's where the imagination comes into. So we really have a mixture between a regrowth succession that's doing itself and a garden where you're playing with the species. We're very pleased, and other people are pleased with that site. And if you want to see it, you go north of Rantoul by a mile, and the road moves out around the cemetery. And you go to the next section road, and you walk back into the prairie. You'll know you're on the right place if you're on the south, you go through the cemetery. If you're on the north, you go through the section road. And there, at both ends, there are huge signs to say that the road is closed. And that is rather helpful to us, because that vacant road attract people to dump material that was unrelated to what we want to do. And so the Department of Transportation has, in its wisdom, cleaned it up as much as they can, and then we have to now not be able to take a vehicle in there, but so we keep wheels at either end and walk in. And that's a little bit of a problem for us, because we do have busloads of volunteers that go there every so often, and it's nice for people who are older who can't get out to just drive by the prairie. So we're sad we've lost that sort of facility, but it makes it more natural site. And one of the problems is that small contractors who don't want to send a gondola of material to the landfill tend to want to drop leftover kitchen remodelings and things like that on that site, and we wish those sorts of people wouldn't do it, but we've had the sheriff watch. You can't really arrest anyone for doing that unless you actually see them dumping it. If that is the case, and one case seems to have transpired, and a fine of $400 is designed to try and stop people from dumping in untoward places. But it's very hard to document and take into action, and you can spend a small fortune trying to pursue dumping. You can do an archaeological dig, and you can find out where all material comes from. But it's not going to take you very far if you haven't actually seen the act in action. So, if we have our druthers in that area, we would like to buy probably about 8 acres of farmland to the south of our Pope Prairie, and it's between 6 acres of the same land that has been bought for cemetery expansion in the future. And the cemetery has planted a rough prairie, and that's complementary to what we're doing. If we did that, if we did buy the piece of land that's there, we would use it more as an educational device, and have walkways through it, and it would be it would help to offload a little the more natural regrowth succession to the north. Let me see what else I have here. So let's go back to the species again, and beg you to find a small prairie. And you don't have to go to the Pope Prairie, which is about 18 miles from town. You can find plants on Route 45 South, on Windsor Road. You can go to the cemetery on St. Mary's Road. Or actually in early spring, if the mowing hasn't been recent, you can find a whole bunch of Ruellia and other things on the cemetery itself. Occasionally you will see a big blue stem growing around a grave. We've had a gentle agreement there that to not have a lot of herbicide. There's a tendency to put herbicide around each grave, and that takes away this sort of natural thing. But if you can figure on the herbicide having to be drunk by someone down the road when it washes down to the Umbra, to the Mississippi, to the Gulf, it creates a dead zone. So if you're visiting the cemetery, it's nice to have a very neat cemetery, but it's also nice to realize that it can help to save some of the habitat that you are down to 0.01% of what was here, and it was 2/3 of the state as prairie. So just wandering around, the railroad line outside the cemetery has purple coneflower, yellow coneflower, a whole bunch of prairie plants in an area that has been left to grow some trees. The autumn olive has taken over to some extent, but I see that just recently that has been mown, and that's a help to us because the prairie plants will come through. The trees are in danger because they can short to the line and create a power problem and also create fires. At the moment, there are some lawsuits in the West that relate to this. The power companies are being accused of having trees close enough to the power lines that shorting has occurred and the creation of a spark that creates a fire. Just wandering around small places, the corner of a field, if you have a drainage corridor, it may have prairie plants on the embankment. If you have a little corner that can be retained rather than dug up, but there's a tremendous tendency to back your huge cultivator right into the corner and take out a corner that may have been there for 100 years because it was a corner that you couldn't turn a team of horses around when you were plowing. So we cherish those little places, and we hope that you will find them, and might be in a cemetery, it might be on a farmland. We lose some of these places fairly regularly. At the moment, we've spent many years trying to save corridor between Paris and Decatur, which was Penn Central line. It closed out, and we encouraged the Department of Natural Resources to buy that corridor for a bicycle way, which sometimes, if you're talented, you can use a bicycle way to preserve a prairie. It's not always so. Like the Kickapoo Trail, the first phase is so wide that it takes out all the native vegetation on either side. And even though that native vegetation may have been what was used to teach in the era when the Nature Conservancy was being established. So we lose it to people who are understanding of what we're trying to do, but the regulations are such that by the time you get through EPA and ADA, the corridor is so wide that you have no nature left, and you have no nature to look at and enjoy. And so we're looking to ask the second phase to not make the trail as wide as that. So you have a conflict between recreation and preservation, and various administrative styles permit more or less of that. Forest Preserve, Champaign County, was 94% prairie, but it's a forest preserve, and forest preserves can be more associated with forest than with prairie, but they do have a conservation responsibility, and the forest preserve does honor the need for prairie preservation and has some excellent prairies already preserved. They're regrowth type prairies, so they're not necessarily saving a remnant, but they're giving people an idea of what their heritage was. There's a Sangamon prairie up near Fisher, which is probably about 5 or 7 years old, and it's beginning to look very much like a prairie. And with a little pizzazz, you can go in and plant some of the more delicate plants, and perhaps have a greenhouse that's associated that will give you an idea of the loving care that you need to do to get some of the more rare species to grow and to survive. You have to watch the deer and the other organisms like rabbits and the like that can easily exterminate a nutritious plant. So getting back to a prairie that's original is rather a challenge. You also have to realize there's a lot of physical activity. How do you do that? Do you hire equipment to mow and to work the area, or do you have individual people with loppers, and how do you get into these sites, and how are they handled as far as water is concerned? These sites are usually on farmland, and the farmland has been drained with underground tiles. So one of the things you usually do with a prairie restoration is that you go in and you have a piece of rebar and you go looking for the drainage patterns so that you can find the drains and block them so that the prairie will have the atmosphere that it usually has. So I think we're near the end. Let me remind you to go to the meeting tomorrow night at Vermilion County at the Community College, 5 to 8. And we thank you profusely for having worked with us with the Pocket Prairie, and continue your interest, please. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.